Welcome to the Intentional Homeschooling podcast. I'm Chantel, and in our homeschool, we read a lot of books. Therefore, this podcast is mostly about books. So today we're going to be talking about cultivating a love of reading in our children. I actually got an email a few weeks ago because I'm often behind on my emails. That really is the reason that sparked this whole podcast. I get a lot of emails about how my kids read so much, how to get them enjoying their reading, how to teach kids to read. And that's what this podcast is really here for. I'm going to be covering all these questions so that I can have a resource to give to people instead of replying with the same long-winded email every single time. And I've chosen the word cultivate on purpose here, as we'll get into. But first, what I want to do at the beginning of each podcast is share a book from the vault, as I'm calling it, and that is a book that I feel like has not gotten enough attention lately. So this week, my book is a middle grade book. I did a picture book last week. We're going to try to spice it up every now and then, and it is Pictures of Hollis Woods. Now, I will have all the books and links that I talk about today in the show notes, so don't worry about hastily writing things down. This is a middle grade story that I see all the time in little free libraries around me, and I hope that means that people have other copies, and it doesn't mean that they're not reading it, because it is such a powerful middle grade book, and it's a short one. It's about 150 pages long. Unfortunately, the back of the book does not do a good job describing it, so I could see if people are reading just the back, or even looking at the picture. The picture doesn't look the cover doesn't look super enticing. They might not want to pick it up based off of that. But in Pictures of Hollis Woods, our main character, her name is Hollis Woods. She was named after a place. She is in foster care, and she goes to live with this lady who is slowly going through either like Alzheimer's or dementia or something of the sort. But she really loves this lady, and so they're trying to hide from social services the fact that this lady is slowly losing her memory. And then meanwhile, we are with Hollis Woods, we're kind of uncovering some of her past with some of her past foster homes. And this is a book that will just like pull at those heartstrings. And I read it, one of those books I read and then pushed on my daughter, and she loved it and then pushed it on a friend, and it's kind of just spiraled. So I would highly recommend Pictures of Hollis Woods. Okay, so now onto the idea of cultivating a love of reading in our children. And I mean, lots of people use different words, but I love the word cultivate because it implies a garden where you plant a seed, you water the seed, you tend your garden, and eventually things start to grow. That's what we do with so much of our homeschool and parenting is you plant those seeds, you water it, you keep tending it, and eventually you start to see the fruit of your labor. So the email I got was asking for ideas on how to cultivate or build a love for reading in children. And I feel like there's maybe two ways to answer this question depending which way the question is asked. So there's kind of two things that might be at play here. In this particular question, her child was 8 years old, I think, which is a time when a lot of things are happening and a lot of things may make it look like they're not enjoying reading. But first of all, my question is, and this is a question to ask if you're wondering about how to, raise readers and children that love to read, is if they're not gravitating towards books, one, is it a fluency issue? Are they just not good enough at reading? Is it a lot of work right now? Or two, do they actually think that they don't like books and stories? And I'm not really going to get a whole lot into the fluency. We're going to talk about it a little bit in some of the points, but I do have a video on my YouTube channel that I shared a while ago that I will leave in the show notes that talked about how we teach reading in our home and build that reading fluency. And I will talk about it at a later date more in depth as well, but that's kind of a whole different issue than getting your kids to fall in love with a good story. So if you feel like your kids aren't great readers. They don't gravitate towards books. Why do you want them to, and why do you think that they're struggling, are good questions to ask yourself. So at around the age of 8 is when kids are often starting to read on their own. And this is when readers children become readers or kind of identify as readers, but then others don't. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that their fluency often is not at the level where their interest is. So what happens around this age for my kids is they go hard with audiobooks because maybe their reading level isn't quite at their age level yet, but they can hear and listen to good stories. And what I want more than them just like sitting down and reading a book is I want them to identify as a reader, as somebody that loves a good story, and I want them immersed in good stories, even if it looks different than just sitting down reading a book. Around the age of 8 is when they're transitioning from, sitting down and reading picture books with you, or sitting down and reading books in general, like doing the whole learning to read, and we kind of expect more independent reading, which is a good thing for them to learn. But if they're not quite ready for that step, it can be a hard process. It's like a hard transition. I know this is something that I have sometimes struggled with because it looks different than I expect. When my kids are doing audiobooks, they're often playing with something, or sometimes just sitting and listening, or I guess they just don't look maybe like they're as engaged as they actually are, but they really are. If I ask them about their books, they can tell me all about it. So depending on maybe the reasoning behind why your child is maybe struggling to become a reader, trying audiobooks can be huge. And sometimes we listen to them together as a family, especially at meal times or as part of our homeschool morning. If they don't want to be alone doing it, you can work that in a little bit. But I also do encourage you to give them some time with audiobooks on their own. And I will share a bunch of titles that my kids have loved during this stage in a little bit later in this episode. Okay, I just want to take a minute to tell you a little bit about the Intentional Homeschooling membership. It is because of my community in the membership that I have the time and resources to make this podcast. So the Intentional Homeschooling membership is just $30 for an entire year, and with it you get homeschool unit studies, novel studies. I have an entire literature-focused preschool curriculum, mama book clubs each season, a community forum, opportunity to sign up for a pen pal, and lots of other goodies. If you are interested in having a homeschool community or learning more through literature, having lots of resources accessible at a very affordable rate, I would love for you to come join me in my homeschool membership. So when it comes to my kids being readers, the thing I want more than seeing them sit and reading a book is for them to love stories. So if that looks different, if it looks like audiobooks, that's great. Part of it is also letting them choose their own books, even when it can be hard. So in the younger stages, when my kids would go to the library, they would pick out those terrible readers, and by terrible I mean I just wanted to gouge my eyes out instead of reading them. They would be like the Disney princess, like the Cinderella story, but is told in like the span of 20 words. And my philosophy with these was always like, you can get those out, but I'm not going to read those to you. Well, I'll read better books to you. But when they're at the stage where they're reading books themselves, I think it is important to let them choose their books, especially if they're trying to build fluency. So this happened last year for my son, or maybe 2 years ago now. The first time he picked up a Dogman book. I mean, it's not my favorite type of literature because I don't know, I guess I just have this impression that it's a lesser kind of book when I really know that it's not. But it's taken a while, I guess, for my brain to adjust. But when he started reading it, something clicked in his brain and suddenly he couldn't get enough of books. And if I had tried to keep pushing on other books that I thought he should be reading, he would probably still be struggling and not enjoying reading. And now, as a result, he has built up his fluency so that he can read other books. I mean, he still loves Dogman, like most boys his age, but it had so many benefits that I'm very thankful to the whole series. One thing I've enjoyed doing with my kids is reading the first book in a series to them, especially the types of books where the series kind of drags on forever, and the reason the series is great is because it gives them lots of exposure, lots of practice for their fluency. But I have had a mentality, kind of like a rule, where these kind of books, I'll read the first one to you, but then if you want to read any more in the series, you need to read them on your own. So I'm thinking like The Boxcar Children, The Babysitter's Club. My son really loved The Calendar Mysteries. All of those, I feel like the first book is generally the best, and they kind of all are fairly the same after that, but like storylines are dragging on forever, but they're so good at building reading fluency. So I don't think they're like a lesser book. I just don't want to read them and bore myself. But if my kids want to spend their reading time that way, that's totally okay with me. And then I continue this as they get older. If they're not sure what they should be reading next, if they've kind of just run out of ideas, then either for our family read aloud or something, I'll pick the first book in a series, and then usually I just let them go off and read the rest on their own, which is a reason that I've never finished a couple book series that we've started together, like Book Scavengers or The Penderwicks. We listened to the first ones together as an audiobook with our family time, and then they went off and listened or read the others, and I still have only read the first one. Another way to cultivate a love for reading is to use bribery. I am a snacky reader. It's probably not the best habit to get into, but I love curling up with a good book and a snack, and I think it's really good to be able to set aside some time in your day, especially if you homeschool. You have more time, more flexibility for this, for them to be reading. In our house, we do 30 minutes in the morning during the school week that they need to be reading. But if you want to pair it with a snack as a little bit more incentive, this kind of makes me think of our poetry tea time that we often do. The kids are there for the snacks. I like the poetry, but I'm glad the snacks keep them there. And I don't think it's a bad way to bribe them to read more. And then kind of playing off of that, I think having set aside time during your day for reading is very helpful. So like I said, we do this in the morning, and since it's part of our schooling, I make them pick, they have to read a book off of a list that I made for them at the beginning of the school year. So I have like a list of 20 books for each of them, and they can pick and choose off of that list which one they want to be reading during that time, but it needs to be one of my pre-approved books. And I've tried to make the list books that I think they'll actually enjoy, but just books that maybe they aren't picking up on their own, or are slightly outside their comfort zone, or just for whatever reason I think that they'll really like. And then one more way that you could add in some extra reading is by giving an extra half an hour of a bedtime. Like they get to bump it back for 30 minutes if they're reading. So you know you have to go to bed at this time, but if you want to read, you can stay up for half an hour later, but only reading is your only option. And we did that for a season, and that worked out very well. There was a lot of reading happening during that time because it was such a special thing to be able to stay awake for half an hour more. If your kids are still you're doing all these things and they're still not really enjoying stories, I would suggest looking at different types of books. Kids all like different kinds of stories. So for my daughter, when she was younger, it was fantasy. That was her in. Now she's leaning more towards like historical fiction and more contemporary stories. For my son, he loves nonfiction, which is out of my comfort zone. So it took me a long time to realize that I needed to supply him with nonfiction books. He also has enjoyed mysteries. So they have different genres that they are gravitating towards. So if I keep pushing a certain genre on them, it might not spark their love for reading, but trying a few different things, we found some things that work. In the last year, my kids have found out that we have a bookstore pretty close to us that is pretty spectacular. I feel bad for anyone that doesn't have one of these, but it has a tree in the middle with a spiral staircase around it that goes up to the children's section of the bookstore. It's amazing, and ever since we went there the first time, that's all they want, like that's the only place they ever want to go. I've been taking my kids on personal dates, and that's the place they want to go to every time. So if you want to promote a love for reading, I would say take your kids to a bookstore, even if it's not as cool as ours. Let them pick out a book. First of all, let them browse forever. My son always grabs like 3 or 4 books that catch his attention, or even more, and then he finds a chair and he looks through them all, reads a little bit, and then decides which one he wants to buy, which is really cute to see. And there's something about browsing a bookstore, seeing all the options, that is really helpful. It really sparks that desire to want to read and like pick up all the books. Okay, I have one more tip or thing that you could try before I give a whole bunch of book suggestions, and that is to kind of be the book sales lady. See yourself as someone that is marketing books to your children. What I mean by this is grab like 3 to 5 books you think your kids will like and give them a very short little blurb about the book to try to entice them, and then let them pick one of those books to try reading. I kind of feel like I do this all the time with my booktube channel. That's the whole purpose of my YouTube channel, is to give people a little snippet of a book and hope that it entices them to pick it up on their own and to read it and then tell others about it. That is something that I love doing naturally, so I do that with my kids all the time. I actually have one more tip. I said that was the last one, but the other thing is to let your kids quit books. I am someone who, if a book is dragging, I am willing to put it aside, maybe come back to it another time, maybe never read it again. And I think that is something that we need to allow our kids to do as well. I mean, if they're quitting every single book, then maybe that needs to get looked into. But we don't need to force them to read books that they're not enjoying if there's not a good reason behind it, because then they'll be scared to pick up a book because they'll know once they start it, they have to finish it. And it's good to let kids know, and let ourselves know, that just because we start a book, it doesn't mean we have to finish it. And like I say, this has to be within reason. They can't just start every book and never finish it. There's also a bit of completing things that's important to learn, but if it's making them pause and not want to pick up books, then it's not really worth it. I think you should be able to let them quit books whenever they feel like it, within reason. Okay, so I have some book suggestions that my kids enjoyed during the stage of kind of reading more on their own, and different series that they could kind of go through, that the series didn't build as it goes. It was all kind of the same level, so they could practice that reading fluency. Whereas something like Harry Potter, the books get thicker and Harry gets older. Like, that's a different kind of series. I'm talking about the kinds that the characters never age and you don't have to worry about what happened in the previous one. And I have a few of those for you. And these are kind of varying levels of difficulty. Definitely my kids have done lots of these on audio, lots of them they've read physically, and I'm just going to give you a bunch of ideas in hopes that some of these will work for your kids. So I already mentioned Dogman. That was like the series that got my son hooked. There's a similar series, a similar looking graphic novel series called Investigators that he also really enjoys. He's been collecting both of those series. He is constantly asking, like, what is the publication date for the next one in this series, because he wants to know, because he wants to have it. Kind of like a girl alternative to that, my daughter really liked Princess in Black at this stage. So it's a princess who, she's just a normal princess kind of by day, but then she goes and she changes into this black outfit, and then she fights off the various creatures in her kingdom without people knowing who she is. That was a fun series. And then we've got more like in the chapter book vein. Magic Treehouse was a really good starter series that really helped my daughter pick up her reading fluency, and she also learned a ton of history. Ramona, I don't know how many times my kids have listened to the entire Ramona collection. they know that you can get the books individually on Libby, or you can get the whole collection on Hoopla audiobook app, and then they only need to use one of their holds for the month, and they can listen to all 8 books in the series. I'm one of those people that I'm not a fan of Ramona, but my kids love her. And in that same vein, we've got most of Roald Dahl's books. George's Marvelous Medicine has been my son's favorite. I love the BFG. You know, pretty much all of his books are pretty fun. Pippi Longstocking, that is one that my son listened to over and over and over again during this stage, and there are a couple books in the series. Geronimo Stilton has a higher reading level, but they do use different kinds of font to help you understand harder words. It's a really cool setup, and there are lots of pictures as well, so it's kind of good for that transition from graphic novel to chapter book. The Whatever After series, this is a fairy tale retelling series that both my kids actually have really enjoyed. And that makes me think of Land of Stories, which is another fairy tale retelling series, just like slightly higher level than Whatever After. And the last one that I'm going to mention, I'm sure I forgot a ton, so you'll just have to stick around for future podcast episodes where I talk about more books. How to Train Your Dragon. My son has listened to that series quite a bit as well. So hopefully this helps you guys to cultivate a love of reading in your kids, in your homes. Also just your kids seeing you read, I think helps a lot. I love that meme that I often put on my homeschool Instagram account, where there's a mom on a phone and her kid beside her is on a phone, and she's asking this other mother, how do you get your kid to read, or something like that. And meanwhile, the mom's reading a book, so the kid's reading a book. Our kids copy us, so if they see us reading, often they'll want to be reading too. So that is all for this week, and I'll be back next week.